It's a privilege to participate in such a reputed literary festival. And I thank all the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Today, I am talking about this book, Medieval Kannada Literature, a Reader. That means it contains both prose descriptions and English translations of Kannada poetry, selected parts. In fact, this is a collaborative work, and Professor B.A. Vivek Rai, a great scholar in Tulu, Kannada, and English, along with me, both of us together have done this work. So occasionally, if I use the word I, please understand it as we. Or if I use the word we, it is not royal we, it is just I. And I proceed further. While talking about the book, I cannot say everything that I want to say. Therefore, I have revolved around a particular theme called a great narrative of crossovers. This term, crossover, is a concept given by the reputed post-colonial critic John Stratton Hawley. And his famous book is, I am sure at least a few are familiar with this book, A Storm of Songs, India and the Idea of Bhakti Movement, published in 2015. He uses the word crossovers to denote what exactly was happening throughout the medieval period, not only in Kannada or Hindi, throughout India, what exactly was happening and how it has been misrepresented as an era of wars, as an era in which Hindus had to save themselves from the Muslim invasion, blah, blah, blah. He rejects all these theories and points out how it was a great period of crossovers. That is the very essence of my talk. First, I shall talk about one or two common problems that all translators face, and they find their own answers. Afterwards, I talk about the major features of this work. First, on translation, the problems not only I faced, but also all the Indian translators who translate from Indian languages to English face. The first one is whether to use diacritical marks or not. There are no set rules, but every person has to find out a balance between the two. The present trend is not to use diacritical marks. In fact, the great MCLI publications, that clearly says no use of these marks. And here is the editor, Dr. Sridhar of the mega project Kumaro Vyasa. And he makes it clear to all of us that no diacritical marks have to be used. We almost followed it in the beginning. But then, when I tried to translate certain poems, I just got nowhere. For instance, H-A-R-A, the word, it can mean Hara, which means Shiva, another name of Shiva, or Hara means garland in Kannada. And the context doesn't help always. Or think of any other word. Mava, M-A-V-A. It could mean the long O, Mava, that means your father-in-law. Or it means Mama, and it has its own meaning in Kannada, in Tamil, and other languages. So what do? Therefore, we formulated a particular use of these marks called the framework of functional diacritical marks. The framework of functional diacritical marks. That means we have to use those diacritical marks which change the meaning, which, if not used, give ambiguity to the particular word or the statement. For instance, the long vowel is functional in the sense it changes the meaning. So use the diacritical mark for that. Similarly, the retroflex sounds in Kannada, particularly, retroflex sounds, they always give a different meaning. If in English you say T-A-G-A-R-U, it can be pronounced as Tagaru or Tagaru. Both have entirely different meanings. Tagaru means a goat. Tagaru means a dry leaf. Tagaru ele. Therefore, for retroflex sounds, we have to use diacritical marks. And secondly, all the length of the novel has to be shown through diacritical marks. And then lastly, there are some special phonemes in Kannada, like sa, sha. It is always shown to us as the difference, Shankar sha and Visha sha. So, and then la, not la, but la. They are functional in the sense meaning changing. Of the some 22 or 25 diacritical marks, we have used in this framework only some 5 to 6 marks. This is the functional framework of the use of diacritical marks we decided. Secondly, the other problem while translating Sanskrit or Kannada or Hindi works to English is what to do with the synonyms. For instance, in Sanskrit and in Kannada following Sanskrit, there are 16 different synonyms for Krishna. Should we always say, Krishna said this, Krishna told her, Krishna went there? Should we always use Krishna, or what do? Do we ignore, or do we use the same word in italics? There are different arguments for different ways, different approaches. What we have done is, we have indicated the person or the object referred to, and also the literal meaning of the synonym. For instance, let us say, Murari. Mura plus Ari, Murari. It means the foe of the demon Mura. But it refers to Krishna. Therefore, what we have done is to use the word Krishna, the foe of the demon Mura. Explain the meaning of the synonym and also give the name of the referred person or object, whatever. This was the second problem that we have to follow. But we have not always translated, as A.K. Ramanujan does, the Ankita or the pen name or the identity name of the Vachanakaras or others. For instance, one Vachanakara, Jedara Dasimaya, uses his Ankita, Ramanatha, always. Ramanatha, always. It can be translated as the father Rama or Rama, father-like, or whatever, but I don't think it will help or it increases the meaning. So we keep Ramanatha, if it is an Ankita Nama or pen name of a particular poet, as Ramanatha, or Chenna Mallikarjuna, Akka Mahadevi's famous Ankita. Ramanujan translates it literally, that is Chenna Mallika Arjuna, like that. But we just keep it as Chenna Mallikarjuna. These are the problems we faced as translators and then came up with these answers. Now, coming to the major features of this anthology. What exactly have we tried to do? And how is it different from other histories of medieval Kannada literature? To start with, this period, the medieval period, runs through 12th century to the 18th or even 19th century. That is about, it's a literature of 8 centuries together. And it is so vast that it's almost impossible to point out any one particular poet or one particular period. So, what we tried to do in this anthology is to keep the criteria and follow it while selecting the works to be translated: representation and substantiality. These were the two criteria that we followed. Representation, to start with. That means there are about 8 major metrical forms used by medieval poets. And from each great poet, using a particular metrical form, we have selected certain passages, certain verses to be translated. That is, we haven't left out any one metrical pattern. Even the particular form usually ignored by the writer, by the translators, that is Shataka poetry, which means a collection of 100 verses on this world and life and society and behavior and all the moral lessons or instructions. But such Shatakas are 100. There are many collections of such. Usually because they are instructive and morally molded, many do not consider it great poetry and don't select. We did select even a few verses from that kind of poetry. Whether it was moralistic or instructive or really genuine poetry, it didn't matter much to us. Secondly, what do we mean by substantiality? I told you how the literature of the medieval period is a huge period of different types of works, poetry, prose, drama, and spread out 8 centuries. So, what is substantial in this great body? How many make it substantial? One can't say. But what we have done is this. We have selected about 82 vachanas and then 97 shatpadis, that is 6-line stanzas, and then 60 compositions of the Haridasas, that is those who bring together music and poetry. 60 compositions and Sangatya, a 4-line stanza form, usually a characteristic of oral poetry, and 76 verses of such Sangatya form. In addition to that, we have included selections from Tattva Pada, that is a particular kind of poetry which centers on a particular guru and the particular ideology, like Nath Panth, etc. Tattvapada, and then from Yakshagana also. That is, we have tried to represent all the forms metrical forms as well as thematic forms of medieval poetry, and we have tried to make it substantial. Secondly, the title is medieval literature. The term medieval here only is descriptive. It is not an evaluative term. Somehow, owing to the division of British and European poetry into Middle Ages and Modern Ages, etc., the term medieval has got a negative connotation. And even here in India, for a long time, it had a very negative connotation. What is there in medieval poetry? Just talk about bhakti and God, and who cares today? It is not true. In fact, there are poems of devotion, there are poems of soul searching on the part of the poet, there are poems about the society and how to reform the society. I mean, it is so vast, even in theme, that we have to bear in mind that medieval literature is perhaps the most experimental and the most important part of Kannada literature. Secondly, the term medieval is used to avoid two common or traditional forms of dividing the particular ages. That is, poet-centered periodization, like the age of Shakespeare, the age of Milton, the age of Eliot, similarly the age of Pampa, the age of Basavanna, etc. We wanted to avoid it because no one poet makes a particular age. It takes all the poets and prose writers and playwrights to build up a particular philosophy, a worldview of a particular age. So we wanted to avoid poet-centered periodization. And secondly, this is what the European historians had done, let us say, at the end of the 19th century. That is, periodization based on religious orientation. Periodization of literature based on religious orientation. That is, this is Jaina poetry, this is Veerashaiva poetry, this is Brahmin poetry, whatever that way. We wanted to avoid that because in any period there were and there are Jain poets, Brahmin poets, Dalit poets, Lingayat poets. I mean, it doesn't matter who it is as long as he is a great poet. From this point of view, when we view medieval Kannada literature with a span of roughly 8 centuries, we realize that the metrical form changes whenever the poet's worldview changes. I consider this a very important point to be noted while reading and understanding and interpreting medieval literature. Whenever the ideology of a particular group of poets changes, the poetic form also, metrical form also changes. We don't find this, I am told by Hindi scholars, in Hindi. In fact, the metrical form remains almost the same, Doha, whether Kabir writes it or somebody else writes it, whatsoever. Here, when the Jaina poets like Pampa and Ranna, Ponna and others were writing, their worldview was different. Their concept of God or godness was different. Their concept of the society was different. They wrote in particular metrical forms. They used Sanskrit metrical forms called Vritta and Kandapadya. Then in the 12th century, it became Shiva-centered, it became people-friendly, it wanted literature to reach the common people. That is, the vachanas written by Akka Mahadevi, Basavanna, Prabhu, and many others, Allama, others. Therefore, their form of expression also changed. They gave up all stanza forms, they used poetic prose, and they wrote in a language which was spoken almost daily by the common people. This is what came with the great revolution that took place in the 12th century under the leadership of Basavanna. Later on, let us say in the 14th century onwards, again, the Shiva-centered way of looking at life changed and gave place to Vishnu or Krishna-centered worldview of life. And hence, even the metrical form changed. All of them, beginning with Raghavanka and going through many other poets like Gadugina Naranappa or Kumaravyasa, Lakshmisha, and others, they used the metrical form called Shatpadi. That is a 6-line stanza form. When even this changed at the time of Tattva-Padkaras, they used a different form of a lyric set to music, which can be performed in public. I consider this a very interesting and curious point in the history of literature of a particular language. Now, yes, pardon me? 10 minutes, okay. Thank you for telling me. Then let me skip one or two points and I go to this one. This was a period in which not only the common people, Dalits, manual workers, cobblers, all these consider themselves equal, came under one particular umbrella and expressed their experiences. This was the period, 16th century mostly onwards, up to the 18th century, that Muslim poets, for instance, Motnahalli Hasan Saab, Chennur Jalal Saab, and then Bada Saheba and others, they entered the Kannada literary world and wrote in Kannada. Though they were born Muslim and had born with an allegiance to Islam, they changed their worldview and also they wrote in Kannada. In fact, the person called Bada Saheba was so enamored of Rama that he wrote about 700 different verses on Rama. Therefore, he was always called Rama Bhakt, or the devotee of Rama. This trend of crossing over seems to be a pan-Indian phenomenon. To take the example of Hindi, we find such poets between the 16th century and the 18th century. We find such poets as Kabir, Dadu, who were the devotees of Rama, and Ras Khan, Rahim, Taj Bibi, Sayyid Murtaza, and others, devotees of Krishna. They went to Brindavan, settled there, and wrote on Krishna, or Krishna and Radha, and what is true love, etc. Similarly, the great writers of Hindi, they went to Delhi to meet the Muslim poets there, especially the Sufi poets and Sufi saints. It was a real period of crossovers. And also, this was the period in which Kannada poetry absorbed many themes and also many forms from the oral tradition. Especially, there is a particular form of poetry written by almost all called Bedagina Vachanagalu. That means it's a sort of a puzzle or a riddle given by a philosopher seriously to tell us something about our soul or godliness, etc. And this one, this Bedagina Vachanagalu or Mundiges, they are plenty in oral literature. It is in the oral tradition that it first establishes itself, and then it is taken over by the other poets. And let us say lastly, this was the period, not the classical period in which Pampa wrote, perhaps arguably not even the first part of the 20th century. Poetry or literature in general was meant to be taken to the common people and understood and appreciated by the common people. This was the period in which it was meant to reach the common people through the tradition of reading very passionately or singing poetry in public and explaining it in simple words. This tradition was called Gamaka, and I'm sure in the afternoon there was a session on Gamaka, and many of you might have heard about it and might have come to know of it. Through this Gamaka tradition, that is, one person sings out certain verses. The other scholar sitting there explains what that verse means to the audience. And therefore, even those unlettered people come to know what Kumaravyasa has written about Krishna, what he has to say, or Lakshmisha has to say about the other Pandavas or the other Kauravas, etc. That is, unless and until literature reaches the common people and molds his personality, it isn't of much use in society. This was a very important point established by medieval Kannada literature. Summing up, therefore, I have skipped over a few points. It's okay. Therefore, truly, medieval Kannada poetry was inclusive in themes, inclusive in the religious affiliations of the poets. It was inclusive, multifaceted. That is, it had place for humor, it had place for love poetry, and it had place for spiritual explorations. Multifaceted, and it was democratic. Perhaps this was the beginning of democracy, first in literature, and then later on, politically, democracy entered India. But much before political democracy, literature in the medieval period had become democratic, as I have shown to you till now. It was a kind of poetry or literature which mirrored crossovers between castes and classes, between religions, between Sanskrit and bhashas, between poetry and music, Persian and Indian architectures, and such. It seems, unfortunately, we have lost that spirit of crossover today. Unfortunately. Thank you very much, and I am obliged to all of you.